In 1965, when John Hays Hammond Jr. died, he left behind a medieval castle on the Massachusetts coast filled with artifacts that should not have been there. Roman columns torn from ancient ruins, medieval doorways pried from French monasteries, entire rooms dismantled stone by stone from European buildings and shipped across the Atlantic. Some called it preservation, others called it plunder. The castle contained one of the largest private collections of medieval and Renaissance artifacts in America, and nobody knew quite what to do with it. Hammond had purchased these treasures legally, but legality and morality are not always the same thing. Post-war Europe had been desperate for cash. Impoverished nobles sold their heritage. Hammond bought it piece by piece and reassembled it in Gloucester, Massachusetts. Now the castle stood as a monument to one man's obsession, filled with the bones of other people's history. Before we can understand what Hammond created and why it troubles us, we need to go back to the beginning, to a boy genius who would become one of America's greatest inventors and most controversial collectors. If you're fascinated by the intersection of genius and obsession, by castles built on controversial foundations, and by the ethical questions that haunt grand estates, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments which historic mansion we should investigate next. Your support makes these detailed documentaries possible. Now, let's discover how an inventor tried to rewrite history. Chapter 1. The Boy Genius. April 13, 1888, San Francisco. John Hays Hammond Jr. entered a world that already understood wealth and ambition. His father, John Hays Hammond Sr., was among the most famous mining engineers in the world. The elder Hammond had made fortunes discovering gold and diamonds in South Africa, survived imprisonment during the Jameson raid, and walked away after paying a $125,000 ransom. He knew Cecil Rhodes personally and advised governments on mineral resources. Young Jack, as the family called him, grew up surrounded by extraordinary achievement and international connections. Exceptional aptitude revealed itself early. While other children played with toys, Jack dismantled clocks to understand their mechanisms. At 14, he built his first radio transmitter. His bedroom transformed into a laboratory filled with wires, batteries, and experimental equipment. His parents recognized something unusual in their son and encouraged his technical curiosity. 1906 brought enrollment at Sheffield Scientific School at Yale University. Jack studied mechanical and electrical engineering, but found the curriculum insufficient for his ambitions. Summers took him to Europe with his family, visiting museums and historical sites. Two passions competed for his attention: cutting-edge technology and ancient history. Most young men would have chosen one path. Hammond pursued both with equal intensity. After Yale, he continued his education in Europe, studying at various institutions and absorbing knowledge that would later define his inventions. Germany offered lectures on electrical engineering. France provided medieval architecture to examine. The combination seemed contradictory, but in Hammond's mind, past and future connected. Technology could unlock ancient secrets. Ancient wisdom could inspire modern innovation. Patents began flowing in his early 20s. Hammond's inventions focused on radio remote control technology, a field barely understood in the early 1900s. Marconi had developed wireless telegraphy for communication. Hammond saw further applications. He believed radio waves could control vehicles, machines, and weapons from a distance. Military implications were obvious. Commercial possibilities seemed limitless. 1914 brought his first major success, a remote-controlled torpedo demonstration for the U.S. Navy. Standing on shore, Hammond guided an unmanned boat through precise maneuvers using radio signals. Naval officers watched in amazement as the vessel responded to commands transmitted through the air. Remote control was not science fiction. It was practical reality, and Hammond had proven it. Military contracts followed. Investors took notice. Money began flowing toward the young inventor. He established Hammond Radio Research Laboratory and surrounded himself with talented engineers. Patents accumulated rapidly. Hammond held dozens by 1920, covering radio remote control systems, selective tuning devices, and frequency modulation techniques. He would eventually accumulate over 400 patents, second only to Thomas Edison in American history. But as his fortune grew, so did his other obsession. Hammond had never stopped thinking about the medieval buildings he had toured in Europe. stone archways, carved doorways. The sense of permanence and history fascinated him as much as any electrical circuit. He began collecting medieval artifacts during his European travels, small pieces at first, then larger acquisitions. Approaching his 30s, Hammond made a decision. A modern house would not suit him. He would build something that honored the past, a castle filled with genuine medieval treasures. Chapter 2. The Inventor's Fortune. Hammond's wealth came from technologies that transformed modern warfare and communication. His radio remote control systems allowed operators to guide torpedoes, aircraft, and ships without direct physical connection. During World War I, militaries around the world recognized the strategic advantage this offered. Hammond's laboratory received contracts from multiple nations, though his primary allegiance remained to the United States. Guglielmo Marconi, the Italian inventor credited with developing practical radiotelegraphy, worked in overlapping fields. Competition arose naturally. Hammond respected Marconi's achievements, but believed his own work on frequency control and selective tuning had advanced beyond what Marconi accomplished. Patent disputes occasionally arose. Hammond usually prevailed, his technical documentation proving superior. Steady income flowed from the patents. Each time someone used Hammond's frequency modulation techniques, licensing fees arrived at his laboratory. Radio manufacturers paid for his selective tuning inventions. Military contractors paid for remote control systems. Money accumulated faster than Hammond could spend it through ordinary means. He invested in other inventors' work, funding research that interested him. Laboratories in both the United States and Europe received his support. Teams of engineers worked on projects that ranged from practical military applications to theoretical investigations of radio wave behavior. Some experiments succeeded, others failed. Hammond could afford failure because his successful inventions funded everything else. Hammond's net worth exceeded several $1 million by the mid-1920s. Adjusted for inflation, this represented wealth equivalent to tens of millions in modern currency. He was not as wealthy as Rockefeller or Carnegie, but he possessed resources far beyond ordinary American prosperity. More importantly, steady income from patents would continue generating revenue for years. In 1926, Hammond married Irene Fenton, a woman from a respectable but not particularly wealthy family. She shared his interest in history and supported his increasingly elaborate plans for a castle. Their relationship would endure for nearly 4 decades, surviving Hammond's eccentricities and obsessions. Hammond never married for money. He married for partnership. Technical genius and substantial wealth created opportunity. Hammond could pursue any project that captured his imagination. Most wealthy men built conventional mansions or purchased existing estates. Hammond decided to do something unprecedented. He would construct a genuine medieval castle on the Massachusetts coast and fill it with authentic artifacts purchased from Europe. The money was available. The vision was clear. Now he needed to acquire the pieces. Chapter 3. A Medieval Obsessions. Childhood travels sparked Hammond's fascination with medieval Europe, but systematic study deepened it. He read extensively about castle construction, Gothic architecture, and medieval life. Correspondence with historians and archaeologists filled his desk. Every significant medieval site he could reach during European trips received his attention. What drew him was not romantic fantasy but genuine historical interest. Hammond wanted to understand how medieval builders achieved their results with limited technology. How did they construct vaulted ceilings without modern engineering? How did they create acoustics in great halls? How did they design defensive fortifications? These questions appealed to his inventor's mind as much as any electrical problem. Small artifacts began arriving in the early 1920s. A carved wooden door from a French monastery, stone fragments from a Spanish chapel, medieval manuscripts and illuminated books. These items decorated his temporary residences, but Hammond envisioned something grander. He wanted to recreate the experience of living in medieval times, surrounded by authentic materials and craftsmanship. Post-World War I travels revealed opportunities. Europe was rebuilding. Old estates were crumbling. Noble families with ancient lineages, but empty bank accounts needed cash. Hammond offered to purchase artifacts that would otherwise deteriorate or be destroyed. To sellers, he appeared as a benefactor preserving history. To critics, he seemed a wealthy American plundering European cultural heritage. International laws protecting cultural property barely existed at the time. Wealthy collectors routinely purchased artifacts and exported them. American museums acquired entire temple facades and medieval cloister arcades through similar transactions. Hammond operated within legal and social norms of the 1920s, though those norms would later face harsh judgment. A French monastery facing demolition yielded his most significant early acquisition. Hammond purchased the building's doorway, complete with carved stone archwork dating to the 13th century. Workers carefully dismantled the structure, numbered each stone, and shipped everything to Massachusetts. Hammond placed the pieces in storage. He did not yet have a building to house them, but he knew one was coming. Irene encouraged his collecting. She enjoyed the European trips and shared his appreciation for medieval art. Their relationship strengthened around this mutual interest. Together they began planning a home that would showcase these treasures, a place where every room would transport visitors backward through time. Hammond owned enough medieval architectural elements to furnish a substantial building by 1925. Stone columns, carved doorways, stained glass windows, wooden ceiling beams, decorative metal work. The collection required a purpose-built structure. The time had come. Hammond would construct his castle. Chapter 4. Buying the Past. This chapter reveals uncomfortable truths about Hammond's collection. His purchases were legal, but the circumstances that made them possible deserve examination. Post-World War I, Europe was economically devastated. Inflation destroyed currencies. Noble families watched their fortunes evaporate. Buildings that had stood for centuries required maintenance that owners could no longer afford. Hammond arrived with American dollars when European aristocrats needed cash desperately. He made generous offers for architectural elements, entire rooms, and decorative pieces that nobles considered family heritage. To sell was painful. Financial necessity left few alternatives. Hammond framed his purchases as preservation, and in some cases, this assessment was accurate. Without his intervention, certain buildings would have collapsed completely, their contents lost forever. Other acquisitions raise harder questions. A Roman column Hammond purchased had been part of a historic structure in Italy. Removing it weakened the remaining building. A medieval doorway he acquired came from a monastery that lost its architectural integrity when that entrance was dismantled. Hammond paid fair prices, but money cannot always compensate for cultural loss. His most controversial purchase involved an entire medieval facade from a French building. The structure was scheduled for demolition to make room for modern development. Hammond offered to purchase the facade and save it from destruction. French authorities approved the export. Workers carefully dismantled the stones and shipped them to America. Hammond considered this preservation. Critics argued it was cultural appropriation, removing French heritage to display in an American castle. The line between preservation and plunder depends on perspective. Hammond genuinely believed he was saving artifacts that would otherwise be destroyed or forgotten. He meticulously documented his purchases, maintained detailed records, and treated acquisitions with respect. He did not smuggle or steal. Everything was purchased through legitimate transactions with proper documentation. Yet his actions participated in a broader pattern of wealthy collectors, extracting cultural treasures from economically weakened nations. American museums and private collectors acquired vast quantities of European, Asian, and Middle Eastern artifacts during this period. Legal permission did not address the ethical question of whether such transactions were fundamentally fair when one party negotiated from desperation. Hammond acquired Roman sarcophagi, Byzantine columns, medieval tapestries, Renaissance furniture, and architectural elements spanning over 1,000 years of European history. His collection grew to include pieces from Italy, France, Spain, Germany, and England. Each purchase had a story. Many of those stories involve sellers parting with treasures they never wanted to lose. Modern perspectives on cultural property have shifted dramatically. Today, international conventions restrict such transactions. Museums return artifacts acquired under questionable circumstances. The assumption that wealth justifies ownership of cultural heritage has been challenged fundamentally. Hammond operated by the standards of his time, but those standards have been revised. Many pieces Hammond purchased would have genuinely been lost without his intervention. Buildings scheduled for demolition yielded architectural elements he preserved. Artifacts stored in deteriorating conditions received professional conservation. His collection became accessible to scholars, and eventually to the public when the castle opened as a museum. Yet removal from original context diminishes cultural understanding. A medieval doorway means something different in a French monastery than in a Massachusetts castle. The educational value of seeing artifacts in their intended setting exceeds the benefit of preserving them elsewhere. Economic desperation created unequal negotiations that favored wealthy collectors over cultural preservation. Hammond's legacy includes preservation and appropriation, rescue and removal, documentation, and displacement. Understanding his collection requires acknowledging this complexity rather than accepting simple judgments. The castle he would build stands as monument to this ethical ambiguity. Chapter 5. The Location and the Vision. Gloucester, Massachusetts appealed to Hammond for specific reasons. The rocky coastline resembled European shores he had admired. Maritime history fed his romantic sensibilities. The location was close enough to Boston for convenience, but isolated enough for privacy. Most importantly, he found a promontory overlooking the Atlantic Ocean that offered dramatic views and natural defense, just as medieval builders would have chosen. In 1926, Hammond purchased approximately 8 acres of coastal land. Granite outcroppings and natural elevation characterized the site. Hammond envisioned a castle that would appear to grow from the rock itself, its stone walls rising as if they had always been there. The Atlantic would crash against cliffs below. The castle would command the heights above, exactly as a medieval fortress would have been positioned. For architectural expertise, Hammond hired Alan W. Jackson, a Boston architect experienced in historical styles. Jackson faced an unusual challenge. Most architects designed buildings from imagination. Jackson needed to design a structure around existing artifacts that Hammond had already purchased. Medieval doorways, columns, and architectural elements were not decorative additions. They formed the foundation of the design. Hammond's instructions were precise. The castle must accommodate his collection of genuine medieval pieces. It must also include modern conveniences disguised within historical aesthetics. Electric lighting should appear to be candlelight. Central heating should hide within medieval stone walls. An indoor swimming pool should look like a medieval courtyard. Jackson had to reconcile authenticity with comfort, history with modernity. The architectural style would be primarily late medieval European, drawing from French and German castle designs. Hammond wanted the great hall of a medieval fortress, the intimate chambers of a Gothic manor, and the defensive appearance of a genuine castle. Visitors should feel transported backward through time. Hammond would enjoy 20th century amenities. Jackson's plans incorporated an 85-foot tower that would serve as both dramatic architectural statement and practical space for Hammond's laboratories. The tower would house some of Hammond's ongoing radio research, positioning his modern inventions within a medieval structure. This juxtaposition captured Hammond's entire philosophy, past and future coexisting in a single location. The Great Hall would be the castle's centerpiece, rising 2 stories with a vaulted ceiling. Hammond planned to install an 8,200 pipe organ here, the largest privately owned organ in America. He was an accomplished organist and wanted an instrument worthy of cathedral acoustics. The Great Hall would provide that sonic environment. An indoor courtyard would serve as swimming pool, though designed to resemble a medieval garden space. A retractable glass roof would allow swimming year-round. When closed, the space would be heated. When open, swimmers would have sky above them. The pool's walls would feature Roman columns and medieval stonework from Hammond's collection, creating the illusion of swimming in ancient ruins. Secret passages would connect various rooms. What medieval castle was complete without hidden corridors? Hammond insisted on these theatrical elements. Revolving bookcases would conceal doorways. Stone walls would hide staircases. The castle would have mysteries for Hammond to enjoy and guests to discover. Hammond's occult interests required suitable accommodation. He wanted a space where he could conduct séances and paranormal investigations. A small chamber would be constructed with specific acoustic properties and minimal external light. Hammond believed that understanding the supernatural required the same empirical investigation as understanding electricity. His castle would provide facilities for both pursuits. Jackson's final plans called for approximately 15,000 square feet of interior space across multiple levels. The structure would include living quarters, entertaining spaces, laboratories, storage for the collection, and rooms dedicated to Hammond's various interests. Construction would require 3 years and cost approximately $1.5 million, equivalent to over $20 million in modern currency. Hammond approved the designs. He had the vision, the architect, the artifacts, and the money. Now he needed workers willing to build a medieval castle in 1920s America. Chapter 6. Building a Medieval Dream Construction began in 1926. The site presented immediate challenges. Building on coastal granite required specialized techniques. Workers carved level platforms from solid rock to establish foundations. The stone was stubborn but permanent, exactly what Hammond wanted. His castle would be anchored to geology as ancient as the artifacts he planned to install within it. Approximately 50 men comprised the construction crew at peak activity. Many were European immigrants with experience in traditional masonry. Hammond needed workers who understood how to handle medieval stonework, how to construct vaulted ceilings, how to install authentic architectural elements without damaging them. American construction workers trained in modern techniques had to learn medieval methods. Shipments arrived regularly at Gloucester Harbor. Crates contained numbered stones from dismantled European buildings. Each piece had been carefully documented before. Removal. Photographs showed original placement. Diagrams indicated how pieces fit together. Workers reassembled these elements like three-dimensional puzzles, matching stone to stone, according to Hammond's detailed records. The Great Hall rose first, establishing the castle's architectural tone. Workers installed genuine medieval columns that Hammond had purchased from various European sources. A 15th-century fireplace from a French castle became the hall's focal point. The fireplace was massive, carved from single blocks of stone, designed to heat large spaces through radiant warmth. Installing it required a crane and 6 men to guide the pieces into position. The vaulted ceiling presented technical problems. Medieval builders had relied on flying buttresses and careful stone placement to create self-supporting arches. Modern steel could simplify this process, but Hammond refused anything obviously anachronistic. Jackson's team designed hidden steel reinforcement that provided structural support without visible presence. The ceiling appeared to be pure stone masonry, achieving impossible spans through medieval engineering. In reality, modern materials secretly carried the weight. Windows required special attention. Hammond had acquired stained glass from various churches and monasteries. Each window had original dimensions that did not necessarily match Jackson's design. Workers modified wall openings to accommodate the glass rather than cutting the precious stained glass to fit standard sizes. Every window gained unique proportions, just as medieval buildings developed organically over time. The indoor courtyard demanded innovative engineering. Creating a swimming pool within a structure designed to look medieval required concealing all modern systems. Plumbing, filtration, heating, and the retractable glass roof all needed to disappear behind authentic-looking medieval stonework. Workers installed Roman columns around the pool's perimeter, positioning them to appear as structural support while hiding mechanical systems behind them. Hammond's 8,200 pipe organ began installation in 1928. The Aeolian Company custom-built the instrument specifically for the Great Hall's acoustics. Workers constructed a special chamber behind the hall to house the organ's mechanisms. Pipes ranged from tiny tubes producing high notes to massive wooden columns creating bass tones that vibrated entire rooms. The instrument weighed several tons and required its own structural support independent of the castle's walls. The tower construction proceeded simultaneously. The 85-foot structure would contain Hammond's laboratory at the top level, providing views over the Atlantic while isolating sensitive radio equipment from interference. Thick stone walls would provide both aesthetic authenticity and practical shielding for experiments. Workers installed an elevator disguised within medieval stonework, allowing Hammond to reach his laboratory without climbing endless stairs. Secret passages were constructed as walls went up. Some connected bedrooms to other parts of the castle. Others led from public spaces to private quarters. One passage ran from the Great Hall to a hidden observation room where Hammond could watch gatherings without being seen. The passages used genuine medieval building techniques with hand-hewn stone and concealed doorways. Throughout construction, Hammond visited constantly, supervising placement of artifacts. approving each installation, modifying plans when necessary. He was not content to let architects and contractors work independently. This was his vision, and he insisted on controlling every detail. Workers grew accustomed to Hammond arriving with new instructions or different artifacts that required accommodation. 3 years transformed Hammond's collection of European artifacts into a functioning medieval-style castle on the Massachusetts coast. 1929 brought substantial completion. The final cost exceeded $1.5 million. Modern materials hid behind authentic medieval elements. Steel-supported stone that appeared to support itself. Electric lighting emerged from fixtures designed to hold candles. Central heating warmed rooms through invisible ducts. Hammond had achieved his goal, a building that looked and felt medieval while providing 20th century comfort. Approximately 15,000 square feet of interior space spread across multiple levels. The castle housed 15 major rooms plus numerous smaller chambers, secret passages, and utility spaces. Every room featured genuine European artifacts integrated into walls, floors, and ceilings. Roman columns supported medieval arches. Renaissance furniture filled Gothic chambers. 1,000 years of European history existed simultaneously within Hammond's American castle. The building would be called Hammond Castle. Subtlety was never Hammond's strength. He had created what he wanted, a genuine medieval environment that was also thoroughly his own. Now he would live in it. Chapter 7. The Castle of Contradictions. Hammond moved into his completed castle in 1929, the same year the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began. America's economy collapsed. Hammond remained insulated by patent income that continued regardless of financial conditions. His inventions were essential to communication and military technology. Demand continued even as other industries failed. Life in the castle revealed Hammond's contradictory nature. Cutting-edge inventor and medieval enthusiast, modern scientist and occult investigator, reclusive researcher and theatrical host. The castle accommodated all these personas. The laboratory and the tower remained operational throughout Hammond's life. He continued developing radio remote control systems, working on frequency modulation problems, and filing patents. His workspace contained the latest electronic equipment, oscilloscopes, radio transmitters, and experimental apparatus. Yet to reach his laboratory, Hammond walked through rooms filled with medieval tapestries and Renaissance furniture. The juxtaposition seemed natural to him. The indoor courtyard functioned exactly as planned. The swimming pool, disguised as a medieval garden space, featured a retractable glass roof that opened in good weather. Hammond swam regularly, exercising in water surrounded by Roman columns and medieval stonework. Guests found the space enchanting and bizarre in equal measure. Where else could one swim laps while gazing at 2,000-year-old Roman artifacts? The Great Hall served as Hammond's primary entertaining space. The massive pipe organ dominated one end. Hammond was an accomplished organist and played frequently, filling the vaulted space with music. The acoustics were cathedral quality. When Hammond performed Bach fugues or improvised compositions, the sound reverberated through stone walls, exactly as it would have in a medieval church. Secret passages delighted Hammond. He used them constantly, surprising guests by appearing from unexpected locations. A bookcase in the library rotated to reveal a hidden corridor. A wall panel in a bedroom opened to a passage leading to the tower. Hammond enjoyed the theatrical possibilities, playing the role of castle lord, with obvious pleasure. His collection of artifacts continued growing even after the castle's completion. Additional medieval and Renaissance pieces arrived whenever opportunities arose. The castle became as much museum as residence, with rooms dedicated to displaying rather than using certain items. A gallery held medieval weapons and armor. A chamber contained illuminated manuscripts. Another space housed his collection of maritime artifacts and ship models. Hammond saw no conflict between studying radio waves and collecting ancient swords. Medieval craftsmen creating vaulted ceilings without steel impressed him as much as modern engineers designing radio circuits. To Hammond, the contradiction between modern inventor and medieval enthusiast was the point. His wife Irene adapted to the castle's peculiarities. She managed the household staff, organized social events, and participated in Hammond's various interests. Their marriage worked because Irene accepted Hammond's eccentricities without trying to change him. She understood that the castle was not merely a home, but an extension of Hammond's personality. Substantial staff maintained the castle. Cleaning 15,000 square feet of space filled with medieval artifacts demanded careful attention. Maintaining the organ required a specialist who tuned the 8,200 pipes regularly. The grounds needed landscaping. The laboratories needed technical support. Hammond employed approximately a dozen full-time staff members to keep his castle functioning. Operating costs were substantial but manageable given Hammond's income. Annual expenses exceeded $50,000, equivalent to over $750,000 in modern currency. This covered salaries, maintenance, utilities, and ongoing acquisitions. Hammond's patent royalties easily covered these costs with money remaining for continued research and collecting. Gloucester locals called it Hammond's Castle, with a mixture of amusement and respect. Some residents appreciated having such an unusual landmark. Others thought Hammond was eccentric at best, possibly mad at worst. The castle's appearance provoked strong reactions. It looked authentic enough to confuse visitors who assumed it must be centuries old, yet everyone knew it had been built recently by an American millionaire. Hammond seemed unconcerned with public opinion. He had built the castle for himself, not for approval. If others found it strange that a modern inventor lived in a medieval castle, that was their problem. Hammond was content. He had created an environment that satisfied all his interests simultaneously. He could work in his laboratory, play his organ, swim in Roman-styled pools, and sleep in medieval chambers. Chapter 8. Séances and Shadows. Hammond's interest in the occult was genuine and systematic. He approached paranormal investigation with the same empirical methods he used for radio research. If supernatural phenomena existed, Hammond believed they could be studied scientifically, measured, documented, and understood. His castle provided an ideal laboratory for such investigations. A small chamber became his séance room. The space was isolated from external noise and light. Heavy curtains blocked windows. Stone walls muffled sound from other parts of the castle. Hammond installed special equipment to detect electromagnetic anomalies, temperature changes, and other phenomena that might indicate paranormal activity. He approached séances as experiments requiring controlled conditions. Hammond hosted regular gatherings devoted to contacting spirits. He invited mediums, psychics, and others claiming supernatural abilities. Some were charlatans. Hammond was wealthy, and frauds sought his patronage. But he was also a skilled experimenter capable of detecting tricks. He exposed several fake mediums, documenting their deceptions with the same precision he used in patent applications. Other sessions produced results Hammond could not easily explain. Strange sounds occurred in sealed rooms. Temperature dropped suddenly without apparent cause. Objects moved when nobody was touching them. Hammond documented these events carefully, but remained skeptical. He wanted repeatable results, scientific verification, proof that would convince other researchers. Anecdotal experiences, no matter how dramatic, were insufficient. His collection included occult objects, medieval grimoires, Renaissance texts on alchemy, artifacts supposedly connected to mystical practices. Hammond acquired these items partly for historical interest and partly for investigation. He wanted to understand what medieval practitioners believed about supernatural forces and whether any truth existed beneath superstition. Gloucester residents whispered about strange lights visible in Hammond's tower late at night. Visitors reported unsettling experiences, cold spots in certain rooms, the sensation of being watched, unexplained sounds echoing through passages. Whether these phenomena were supernatural or simply the effects of an old building in a dramatic coastal location remained debatable. Hammond invited distinguished guests to participate in séances. Scientists, academics, and intellectuals attended out of curiosity or genuine interest. Some left convinced they had witnessed genuine paranormal activity. Others departed certain they had watched elaborate theater. Hammond himself remained ambiguous, neither fully endorsing nor completely dismissing supernatural explanations. His most famous alleged encounter involved attempting to contact Thomas Edison. Hammond had known Edison personally and respected the older inventor. After Edison's death in 1931, Hammond attempted to reach Edison's spirit through séances. He believed that if anyone could communicate across the veil between life and death, it would be another inventor using technical means. These sessions produced no verified results. Hammond recorded various phenomena, but acknowledged that none constituted proof. He continued investigating spiritualism throughout his life, never quite abandoning the search, but never claiming definitive success. For Hammond, the occult remained an unsolved problem worth continued study. The castle itself seemed to encourage supernatural speculation. Its medieval architecture, secret passages, and dramatic coastal location created an atmosphere where unusual experiences felt plausible. Guests lying in rooms decorated with ancient artifacts could easily imagine presences from the past lingering in the shadows. Whether these feelings reflected actual phenomena or psychological suggestion remained uncertain. Hammond's occult interests damaged his scientific reputation among some peers. Serious researchers viewed spiritualism with suspicion. A man who filed patents for radio remote control systems should not, they felt, waste time attempting to contact the dead. Hammond ignored such criticism. He investigated what interested him regardless of others' opinions. Many respected scientists had explored paranormal phenomena. William James had investigated mediums. Oliver Lodge had pursued psychical research. Hammond was in distinguished company, even if mainstream science rejected such inquiries. He approached the occult empirically rather than credulously, which distinguished him from mere enthusiasts. The séances continued throughout Hammond's residence in the castle. Some historians suggest they were partly theatrical, performances Hammond enjoyed staging for guests. Others believe he genuinely sought supernatural understanding. Probably both interpretations contain truth. Hammond was capable of simultaneously believing and doubting, investigating seriously while appreciating the dramatic possibilities. After Hammond's death, ghost stories proliferated. Visitors reported seeing Hammond's spirit in the tower. Staff members claimed to hear organ music late at night when nobody was playing. Whether Hammond would have been amused or satisfied by such tales remains unknown. Chapter 9. The Golden Years. The 1930s and 1940s represented Hammond Castle's peak years. Economic depression affected most Americans. Hammond's patent income remained substantial. He continued hosting gatherings, pursuing inventions, and expanding his collection. The castle functioned as he had envisioned, a private domain where modern innovation coexisted with medieval aesthetics. Hammond's social circle included inventors, scientists, artists, and eccentric intellectuals. He preferred guests who shared his wide-ranging interests. Dinner conversations moved from radio engineering to medieval history to paranormal investigation without pause. Hammond's hospitality was generous. Guests stayed for days or weeks, enjoying the castle's unique atmosphere. The Great Hall hosted concerts and performances. Hammond's organ playing provided regular entertainment. He sometimes invited other musicians to perform, filling the space with sound. The acoustics made even modest performances sound magnificent. Professional organists who played Hammond's instrument marveled at its quality and the room's resonance. The castle appeared in newspapers and magazines during this period. Popular Mechanics published an article about Hammond's inventions and his unusual home. Architectural journals documented the building's medieval elements and modern engineering. The public was fascinated by the inventor who lived like a medieval lord while developing 20th century technology. Hammond's work continued producing valuable patents. During World War II, his radio remote control systems became militarily significant. The U.S. government contracted for various applications of his technology. Hammond never achieved the public fame of Edison or Einstein, but within scientific circles his reputation remained strong. He was a problem solver whose inventions had practical military and commercial applications. Irene managed the castle's household operations. Hammond focused on research and collecting. They entertained together, traveled together, and shared the eccentric lifestyle the castle required. Irene seemed genuinely content with her unusual circumstances, suggesting either remarkable adaptability or genuine appreciation for Hammond's vision. The collection continued growing. Hammond acquired additional medieval artifacts whenever opportunities arose. Post-World War II Europe again offered desperate sellers. Hammond purchased pieces from bomb-damaged estates and families impoverished by war. His collection became one of the largest privately held assemblages of medieval and Renaissance artifacts in America. Visitors during this period described the castle as overwhelming. Every surface, displayed something historically significant. Rooms contained layers of history, Roman columns supporting medieval arches beneath Renaissance ceilings. The density of artifacts created an immersive environment unlike anything else in America. Hammond had succeeded in making visitors feel transported backward through time. Constant maintenance kept the castle functioning. Salt air from the Atlantic corroded metal. Stone needed regular inspection. The organ required expert care. Hammond invested in preservation, understanding that without proper maintenance, his collection would deteriorate. He employed specialists to treat artifacts properly, using conservation techniques appropriate for museum-quality pieces. Operating costs remained substantial. Annual expenses exceeded $75,000 by the 1950s, equivalent to over $750,000 in modern currency. Hammond's income still covered these costs comfortably. His patents continued generating royalties. Investment income supplemented patent revenues. Financially, the castle remained sustainable during Hammond's lifetime, but Hammond was aging. Born in 1888, he was approaching his 70s by the late 1950s. His health began declining. The energy that had driven decades of inventing and collecting diminished. He still worked in his laboratory and played his organ, but less frequently. The castle's golden age was ending, though nobody yet recognized this. Irene noticed the changes. Hammond moved more slowly, tired more easily, complained of various ailments. She encouraged him to slow down, to rest more, to let others handle routine matters. Hammond resisted. He had never stopped working. The idea of retirement held no appeal. Time and biology were asserting themselves regardless of Hammond's preferences. The castle that had been built to last forever was approaching its first major crisis, the loss of the man who had created it and sustained it. What would happen to Hammond Castle when Hammond himself was gone? Chapter 10. The Inventor's Twilight. The 1960s brought decline. Hammond's health deteriorated steadily. He suffered from various ailments related to aging, heart problems, reduced mobility, chronic pain. The man who had climbed to his tower laboratory regularly now struggled with stairs. The inventor, who had worked 16-hour days, now needed frequent rest. His research continued, but at reduced pace. He still filed occasional patents, his final one coming in 1959. The pace of innovation that had characterized his earlier decades slowed to occasional insights. Hammond's mind remained sharp, but his body failed to keep up. Implementing ideas required physical effort he could no longer sustain consistently. Maintaining 15,000 square feet of space filled with priceless artifacts required constant attention. Hammond could no longer supervise maintenance personally. He relied on staff to handle routine operations, but he worried constantly that things were not being done properly, that artifacts were at risk, that his creation was vulnerable. Irene shouldered increasing responsibilities. She managed finances, coordinated staff, handled correspondence, and dealt with practical matters Hammond could no longer address. Their relationship remained strong, but the dynamic shifted. Hammond had built the castle to realize his vision. Now Irene worked to preserve that vision as Hammond's capacity diminished. Financial concerns emerged for the first time. Hammond's patent income was declining as older patents expired. His most valuable inventions dated to the 1910s and 1920s. Patents lasted only 17 years before entering public domain. Revenue that had sustained the castle for decades was gradually disappearing. Hammond's investments provided some income, but not enough to cover operating costs indefinitely. Hammond had no children. His legacy would pass to Irene, but she was not significantly younger. Who would maintain the castle after both were gone? Should they consider selling, donating to an institution, converting it to a museum? Every option presented problems. Selling seemed impossible. Who would purchase a castle filled with European medieval artifacts in Gloucester, Massachusetts? The property was too expensive for ordinary buyers and too eccentric for institutional purchasers. Museums might want the collection, but not the building. Real estate developers might want the land, but would probably demolish the castle. Donating to an institution required finding one willing to accept the responsibility. Universities had endowments to maintain donated properties, but Hammond Castle's operating costs exceeded what most institutions could absorb. The building was not adaptable to academic use. It was a private residence designed for one man's peculiar combination of interests. Converting to a museum while they lived appealed to both. They could maintain control during their lifetimes while preparing for eventual public access. But museums required professional staff, insurance, accessibility modifications, and ongoing funding. Hammond lacked resources to establish an endowment sufficient for perpetual operation. No firm decisions were made. Hammond hoped his health would improve, that he would have more time to address these problems. Irene recognized that time was limited but hesitated to pressure her ailing husband. They postponed difficult choices, focusing instead on daily management. Hammond's last years were spent primarily within the castle. He rarely traveled. Visitors came less frequently. Social gatherings that had characterized earlier decades diminished. Hammond played his organ occasionally, finding comfort in music. He walked through rooms filled with the artifacts he had spent decades collecting, remembering the acquisition of each piece. He must have wondered whether his creation would survive him. The castle was his attempt at permanence, his monument to medieval craftsmanship and modern innovation. Permanence requires maintenance. Maintenance requires money. Hammond understood that without sustainable funding, even buildings constructed of stone eventually crumble. In early 1965, Hammond's health declined sharply. He knew he was dying. He made what preparations he could, ensuring Irene would inherit the property and collection. But he could not solve the fundamental problem. How would the castle survive without him? On February 12, 1965, John Hays Hammond Jr. died at age 76. He had lived to see television, computers, space exploration, and technologies that would have seemed impossible during his youth. His own inventions had contributed to this progress. His medieval castle, the project that had consumed more of his fortune than any invention, faced an uncertain future. Irene was left alone in the castle, surrounded by artifacts, facing questions Hammond had postponed too long. The crisis had arrived. Chapter 11. Death and Dilemma. When Hammond died, the immediate question was simple: what happens now? Irene inherited the castle, its contents, and the responsibility of maintaining both. She was 74 years old, had no experience managing such a property independently, and faced financial challenges Hammond had barely begun to address. The collection alone was valuable. Estimates suggested the medieval and Renaissance artifacts were worth several $1,000,000. But selling piecemeal would destroy Hammond's vision. The collection made sense as a whole, installed within the castle he had built to house it. Separating artifacts from their context would reduce both artistic and financial value. Operating costs remained approximately $75,000 annually. Irene had some income from Hammond's remaining assets, but not enough to sustain the castle indefinitely. She needed a solution within months, not years. Property taxes alone exceeded $10,000 per year. Heat, electricity, insurance, staff salaries, maintenance, and repairs consumed the rest. She considered her options. Living in the castle alone was impractical and expensive. Selling was difficult given the property's unique nature. Donating required finding an acceptable institution. Converting to commercial use might preserve the building, but would fundamentally change its character. The Catholic Church expressed interest. Specifically, the Diocese of Boston investigated acquiring the property for use as a retreat center or religious institution. Church officials toured the castle, examined the collection, and discussed possibilities with Irene. The arrangement seemed promising. The church had resources to maintain the property and interest in the medieval artifacts, many of which had religious significance. In 1966, after negotiations, Irene sold Hammond Castle to the Catholic Church for an undisclosed sum. The transaction included the building and most of its contents. Irene retained certain personal items and moved out. She had lived in the castle for 37 years. Leaving must have been painful, but at 75 years old, she could not maintain it alone. The church's ownership was brief and troubled. Religious institutions were experiencing financial pressures during the 1960s. Vatican II was reforming Catholic practices, creating uncertainty about future directions. The Diocese of Boston had numerous properties requiring attention. Hammond Castle, despite its appeal, was not essential to church missions. Adapting the castle for religious purposes proved difficult. The medieval atmosphere was appropriate, but the layout was designed for private residence, not institutional use. Secret passages delighted Hammond, but complicated supervision of retreat attendees. The organ was magnificent, but secular in character. The collection included religious artifacts but also occult items that made church officials uncomfortable. Operating costs exceeded what the diocese had anticipated. Maintaining medieval stonework required specialists. The organ needed expert care. Insurance for the valuable collection was expensive. Within 2 years, the church recognized that Hammond Castle was an unsustainable burden. In 1968, the diocese sold the property to a private foundation, established specifically to operate Hammond Castle as a museum. The foundation's creation represented a new approach, except that the castle could not function as a private residence and convert it to public institution, make it self-sustaining through admission fees, event rentals, and donations. Transitioning from private residence to museum required significant changes. Rooms needed to be rearranged for visitor flow. Safety features had to be installed. Handicap accessibility required modifications. Museum staff needed training. Insurance requirements were strict. The property needed marketing to attract visitors. The foundation opened Hammond Castle Museum to the public in 1970. Admission was charged. Tours were guided. The collection remained displayed as Hammond had installed it, but now thousands of people annually would walk through rooms designed for one family's use. The castle had been transformed from private obsession to public attraction. This seemed like a solution, but problems persisted. Admission fees alone could not cover operating costs. The castle was located in Gloucester, not a major tourist destination. Visitor numbers fluctuated seasonally. Winters were harsh, and few people wanted to tour a stone castle in freezing weather. The foundation struggled financially from the beginning. Different operators attempted various strategies over subsequent decades. Wedding receptions were permitted in the Great Hall, generating rental income. Corporate events used the castle as a unique venue. Educational programs brought school groups for history lessons. Halloween events capitalized on the castle's spooky atmosphere. Each operator tried something new, searching for a sustainable business model. Medieval castles are expensive to maintain, and this one was located in Massachusetts rather than a major European tourist center. No amount of creativity could overcome the basic economics. Hammond had sustained the castle through personal wealth. Without that, survival required constant struggle. The castle's ownership and operational control changed hands multiple times over the following decades. Each new operator arrived with optimism and departed frustrated. The building survived, but barely. It became a symbol of the preservation challenge facing America's eccentric architectural heritage. Beautiful, historically significant, and desperately impractical. Chapter 12. The Museum. Question operating Hammond Castle as a public museum revealed challenges Hammond never considered. Private ownership allowed him to ignore practicalities that museums cannot. Public access requires safety measures, accessibility compliance, staff training, insurance, marketing, and sustainable funding. Hammond Castle struggled with all of these. The building structure complicated museum operations. Secret passages could not be opened to unsupervised visitors. Certain rooms were too fragile for regular traffic. The tower laboratory contained equipment that needed protection. The organ could not be played by casual visitors. Museum staff had to balance public access with preservation. Visitor experience was mixed. People who appreciated medieval architecture and Hammond's eclectic collection found the castle fascinating. Others were disappointed by the hodgepodge quality of the collection. Unlike museums that organized displays thematically, Hammond Castle presented artifacts as Hammond had installed them, according to aesthetic preferences rather than historical coherence. In the 1970s and 1980s, few people questioned how American collectors had acquired European artifacts. The assumption was that Hammond had saved these pieces from destruction. His collection was seen as preservation, not appropriation. Cultural attitudes shifted. International conventions on cultural property changed how museums approached acquisitions. Repatriation movements gained momentum. Questions arose about colonial-era collecting practices and power imbalances in artifact transactions. Hammond's purchases, made legally in the 1920s, looked more problematic through modern ethical lenses. Some scholars argued that Hammond Castle should acknowledge the controversial origins of its collection. Interpretive materials should explain that Hammond purchased artifacts from economically desperate sellers. Context should be provided about post-World War I Europe's situation. The museum should not simply celebrate Hammond's collecting, but also examine the ethics of his actions. Many pieces would have been destroyed without Hammond's intervention. Buildings scheduled for demolition yielded architectural elements Hammond preserved. His documentation and care maintained artifacts that might otherwise have been lost. The castle itself was a monument to preservation, however imperfect. The museum attempted to address multiple perspectives. Tour guides acknowledged that some acquisitions were controversial by modern standards, while emphasizing Hammond's genuine interest in preservation. Educational materials provided context about 1920s collecting practices. The goal was honesty, without condemning Hammond retroactively for acting according to his era's norms. Financial sustainability remained the primary challenge. Admission fees provided insufficient income. The museum relied on donations, grants, and event rentals. Economic downturns immediately affected visitor numbers. The 2008 recession hit particularly hard as discretionary spending on museum visits declined sharply. Different operators tried various approaches. One focused on paranormal tourism, marketing the castle's ghost stories, and Hammond's séances. Halloween events drew large crowds willing to pay premium prices for haunted castle experiences. This generated revenue but arguably trivialized the building's historical significance. Another operator emphasized educational programming, partnering with schools to provide hands-on medieval history lessons. Students explored the castle, examined artifacts, and learned about Hammond's inventions. This approach enhanced the museum's reputation, but generated minimal revenue as school groups negotiated discounted admission. Wedding rentals provided the most reliable income. The Great Hall was a dramatic setting for ceremonies. Couples paid substantial fees to marry in the castle. Weekend bookings filled the calendar during wedding season. This use required frequent setup and breakdown, created wear on the space, and limited public access during peak summer months. The museum also hosted concerts, taking advantage of the hall's excellent acoustics and the magnificent organ. Organists from around the country sought opportunities to play Hammond's instrument. These events attracted classical music enthusiasts and generated positive publicity. Concert revenues alone could not sustain operations. By the 2010s, the fundamental question remained unanswered. Could Hammond Castle survive as a museum? Every year required financial creativity to cover expenses. Deferred maintenance accumulated because funds were insufficient for proper repairs. The building was deteriorating slowly, and nobody had resources to address long-term preservation needs. Various stakeholders debated alternatives. Should the castle seek National Historic Landmark status to qualify for preservation grants? Should it pursue partnerships with universities or larger museums? Should it consider more radical changes, perhaps converting some spaces to residential use to generate steady income? Each option had drawbacks. National Historic Landmark status required extensive documentation and might impose restrictions on how the building could be used. University partnerships raised questions about control and mission compatibility. Residential conversion would fundamentally alter the property's character. The museum continued operating year to year, event to event, struggling with the same challenges that had plagued it for decades. The castle Hammond built to last forever was surviving, but just barely. Its future remained uncertain, dependent on the dedication of people willing to work harder than seemed reasonable for a building that never quite paid its own way. Chapter 13. Ethical Reckoning. Modern perspectives on Hammond's collection require confronting uncomfortable truths. The artifacts in Hammond Castle represent cultural heritage removed from original contexts, purchased from economically vulnerable sellers, and displayed for one man's pleasure. Consider the medieval monastery doorway in Hammond Castle. Carved by anonymous craftsmen in 13th century France, it welcomed worshippers for 6 centuries. When Hammond purchased it in the 1920s, the monastery was crumbling. Local authorities approved removal. The alternative was likely destruction as the building collapsed. Hammond documented the doorway carefully, preserved it properly, and displayed it respectfully. He saved something beautiful from loss. That doorway meant something different in its original context. It was part of a community's heritage, connected to local history, integrated into a building where every element related to every other. Removing it severed those connections. The French village lost part of its identity. Hammond gained an impressive artifact. The transaction was legal, but imbalanced. Desperation motivated sellers. Wealth empowered the buyer. This pattern repeated across Hammond's collection. Roman columns came from deteriorating Italian buildings. Medieval windows came from Spanish chapels. Renaissance furniture came from impoverished estates. Each purchase had a story of need-meeting means. Hammond believed he was rescuing artifacts. Sellers believed they had no choice. Power lay entirely with Hammond. International law has evolved to restrict such transactions. The 1970 UNESCO Convention on Cultural Property established that archaeological and artistic heritage belongs to nations, not individuals. Export of significant artifacts requires government permission. Purchases made under economic duress are increasingly considered illegitimate. Standards that Hammond satisfied in 1920 would not satisfy ethical guidelines today. Museums worldwide are grappling with colonial-era acquisitions. The British Museum faces demands to return the Parthenon marbles to Greece. Egyptian authorities want artifacts taken during British occupation. Native American tribes seek repatriation of sacred objects. The assumption that Western institutions should possess cultural treasures from around the world has been challenged fundamentally. Hammond Castle exists in this context. The collection contains artifacts that modern ethics would question. Should they be returned to countries of origin? The question is complicated because many original buildings no longer exist. The monastery that lost its doorway has been demolished. Returning the doorway means finding another context, not restoring it to original location. Without Hammond, many artifacts would have been lost permanently. His collection educates visitors about medieval and Renaissance culture. The artifacts are professionally maintained and publicly accessible. These outcomes have value. Yet preservation cannot excuse appropriation entirely. Hammond had alternatives. He could have donated money to preserve buildings in their original locations. He could have supported European museums rather than building his own collection. His choice to remove artifacts, however well-intentioned, participated in a larger pattern of wealthy Westerners, extracting cultural heritage from poorer regions. The museum acknowledges these debates without resolving them. Tour materials explain that collecting practices acceptable in the 1920s are questioned today. Visitors learn about Hammond's motivations and the historical context. The museum does not apologize for the collection's existence or promise repatriation. The position is that we can appreciate Hammond's preservation efforts while recognizing ethical complexity. Hammond himself would likely be baffled by these debates. He considered himself a preservationist saving artifacts from destruction. He documented carefully, maintained properly, and displayed respectfully. His intentions were genuine. Intention and impact differ. Hammond's good intentions created ethical complications that outlived him. The collection's value complicates any resolution. Returning artifacts to European institutions would require identifying rightful owners, negotiating transfers, and arranging transportation. The financial cost would be substantial. Hammond Castle Museum lacks resources for such undertakings. European institutions might not want artifacts removed from original context over a century ago. Practically, the collection will probably remain where Hammond installed it. The ethical questions persist, unresolved, and perhaps unresolvable. Hammond Castle stands as monument to preservation and appropriation, to one man's passion and to the power imbalances that enabled his collecting. Visitors must decide for themselves whether what they see represents rescued heritage or stolen history. Chapter 14. The Castle. Today, Hammond Castle continues operating as a museum open to the public year-round with seasonal variations in hours. Visitors purchase tickets and take guided tours through the Great Hall, courtyard, tower, and various chambers. The experience remains much as it was when the museum opened, walking through spaces Hammond designed, viewing artifacts he collected, and contemplating the unusual mind that created this place. The Great Hall impresses immediately. The vaulted ceiling rises dramatically overhead. Medieval columns support arches that seem impossible without modern engineering. The pipe organ dominates one end, its 8,200 pipes rising in gleaming ranks. Guides explain Hammond's skill as an organist and his insistence on cathedral acoustics. During special events, organists perform concerts, filling the space with music that demonstrates the instrument's power. The indoor courtyard remains one of the most popular features. The swimming pool still functions. though it's used only occasionally for special events rather than daily recreation. Roman columns surround the water. The retractable glass roof opens in good weather. Visitors struggle to reconcile the space's medieval appearance with its modern purpose. Past and present occupy the same space, exactly as Hammond intended. The tower offers views over the Atlantic. Visitors climb to the laboratory level where Hammond conducted radio experiments. Some original equipment remains displayed, showing the workspace of an inventor who held over 400 patents. The juxtaposition of medieval stonework and early 20th century electronics illustrates Hammond's dual identity: cutting-edge scientist and medieval enthusiast. Secret passages fascinate visitors. Guides demonstrate revolving bookcases and hidden doorways. Some passages are accessible, others remain closed for safety reasons. The theatrical elements that delighted Hammond still entertain guests decades after his death. The collection fills every room. Roman artifacts sit beside medieval stonework beneath Renaissance ceilings. Visitors see Gothic furniture, medieval weapons, illuminated manuscripts, and religious artifacts spanning over 1,000 years. The density can be overwhelming. Some visitors appreciate the richness, others find it chaotic. Hammond never organized his collection by historical period or cultural origin. He arranged things according to aesthetic preferences. Interpretive materials provide context. Plaques explain artifact origins, Hammond's biography, and construction details. Tour guides supplement this information with stories about Hammond's eccentricities, his séances, and famous visitors. The narrative balances celebration of Hammond's achievements with acknowledgement of controversies surrounding his collecting practices. Educational programs bring school groups to learn about medieval history, architectural engineering, and early 20th century innovation. Students explore the castle, examine artifacts, and participate in activities designed to make history tangible. These programs serve hundreds of children annually, introducing new generations to Hammond's legacy. Halloween events capitalize on the castle's spooky atmosphere. Castle Frights features haunted tours with actors, special effects, and paranormal themes. These events generate substantial revenue and attract visitors who might not otherwise visit. The approach is theatrical rather than historical, prioritizing entertainment over education. Wedding rentals continue providing essential income. The Great Hall hosts ceremonies throughout the year. Couples are drawn by the dramatic setting and unique atmosphere. The castle photographs beautifully, providing memorable backdrops for wedding albums. Weekend bookings fill months in advance during peak season. Maintenance remains an ongoing challenge. The building is approaching a century old. Stone requires periodic treatment. The organ needs expert care. Plumbing and electrical systems need updates. Roof repairs are expensive. The museum budgets for maintenance, but often defers non-essential projects due to limited funds. The collection requires conservation. Textiles fade, wood cracks, metal corrodes. Professional conservators examine artifacts periodically and recommend treatments. Conservation is expensive, and funding is limited. The museum prioritizes pieces in worst condition and hopes others survive until resources become available. Financial sustainability has improved but remains precarious. Multiple revenue streams, admissions, events, rentals, donations, combine to cover operating costs. The museum operates with a small permanent staff supplemented by seasonal workers and volunteers. Nobody is getting rich. People work at Hammond Castle because they love the place, not for financial reward. Visitor numbers fluctuate. Good years bring 15,000 to 20,000 people. Bad years see numbers drop below 10,000. Economic conditions, weather, and competing attractions all affect attendance. The museum constantly markets itself, seeking to attract new audiences while maintaining relationships with regular visitors. The building's future depends on continued community support and creative management. No single revenue source can sustain operations. Success requires combining multiple strategies: tourism, education, events, and donations. The model is fragile but functional. Hammond Castle will likely continue operating as a museum for the foreseeable future. The building is structurally sound despite needing maintenance. The collection remains significant despite ethical questions. Community support continues despite financial challenges. The castle survives because enough people believe it deserves survival. Chapter 15. The Legacy of Hammond Castle. John Hays. Hammond Jr. built a medieval castle in 1920s Massachusetts because he could. Wealth and vision combined to create something that should not exist. A genuine medieval environment constructed with authentic European artifacts on the American coast. The result defies easy categorization. Hammond's legacy is complex. As an inventor, he contributed significantly to radio remote control technology. His 400-plus patents advanced communication and military systems. His work influenced technologies we use daily. This aspect of his legacy is unambiguously positive. Hammond was a brilliant inventor whose contributions deserve recognition. As a collector, his legacy requires more nuanced assessment. He preserved artifacts that might otherwise have been lost. He documented carefully, maintained properly, and eventually made his collection publicly accessible. These are positive outcomes. He also participated in a system that extracted cultural heritage from economically vulnerable regions. His purchases were legal but ethically complicated. Modern standards questioned transactions he considered appropriate. As a castle builder, Hammond created something unique. Few private residences in America rival Hammond Castle's ambition and eccentricity. The building itself is architectural achievement, successfully integrating genuine medieval elements into a modern structure. The engineering required to make Roman columns support medieval arches beneath Renaissance ceilings while hiding modern utilities demonstrates impressive technical skill. The castle raises questions about American relationships with European heritage. Why did Hammond feel compelled to recreate medieval Europe in Massachusetts? What did this say about American culture in the 1920s? The castle represents an era when wealthy Americans sought to claim European sophistication by literally purchasing European artifacts. This impulse reveals anxieties about American cultural legitimacy and attempts to establish instant tradition through acquisition. Hammond's dual identity, scientist and medievalist, suggests someone uncomfortable with his own era. He pioneered technologies that shaped the 20th century, but lived surrounded by artifacts from the medieval period. This contradiction may reflect ambivalence about modernity. Hammond helped create the modern world through his inventions, but apparently found greater satisfaction in spaces that evoked the past. His occult interests add another layer of complexity. Hammond approached paranormal investigation scientifically, seeking empirical evidence for supernatural phenomena. This represents an attempt to reconcile reason and mystery, to apply modern methods to ancient questions. His séances in the castle connected his medieval surroundings to his scientific mindset, searching for truths that transcended either period. The castle's survival demonstrates the value of architectural preservation and its challenges. Buildings like Hammond Castle are expensive to maintain and difficult to adapt for modern uses. Without Hammond's personal wealth, the castle requires constant fundraising and creative management. It survives not because survival is easy, but because dedicated people work to keep it alive. For visitors today, Hammond Castle offers multiple experiences. History enthusiasts appreciate the medieval and Renaissance artifacts. Architecture students study the engineering required to integrate historical elements into modern construction. Music lovers attend concerts featuring the magnificent organ. Ghost hunters seek paranormal experiences in a building with appropriate atmosphere. Each group finds something valuable in Hammond's creation. The castle also serves as cautionary tale about private collecting. Hammond had resources to acquire, preserve, and display. His collection. Sustainability required more than money during his lifetime. It required planning for perpetual maintenance. Hammond postponed these decisions, leaving others to solve problems he created. Anyone who builds something magnificent must also ensure it can survive them. Ethical debates about the collection will continue. International perspectives on cultural property keep evolving. Future generations may judge Hammond's collecting even more critically than we do, or they may emphasize preservation over provenance questions. The castle itself will remain, silently witnessing how each era reassesses Hammond's legacy. Hammond Castle is many things: architectural achievement, ethical dilemma, preservation success, appropriation monument, inventor's playground, medieval fantasy, American folly. It contains contradictions Hammond never resolved and perhaps never recognized. He built something beautiful that troubles us, something impressive that makes us uncomfortable, something worth preserving despite questions about how it came to exist. The castle endures because it matters, though why it matters keeps changing. Hammond thought he was preserving history. We see him rewriting it, removing artifacts from original context and reassembling them according to personal vision. Hammond Castle is rescue and removal, appreciation and appropriation, monument to one man's passion and to the power that passion could exercise over other people's heritage. Stand in the great hall today, beneath the vaulted ceiling, surrounded by artifacts spanning a millennium. You experience what Hammond created, a space where past and present collide, where beauty and ethics tangle, where preservation and plunder are difficult to separate. The castle forces engagement with uncomfortable questions. That may be its greatest value. Hammond built a medieval castle in Massachusetts, filled it with European treasures, and left us to wrestle with what his creation means. The building survives. The questions remain unanswered. Thank you for exploring the dark and complex story of Hammond Castle with me. If this investigation into the inventor who tried to rewrite history fascinated you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments, which controversial estate should we examine next? Hearst Castle and its newspaper empire, the Vanderbilt mansions and their railroad fortunes, or perhaps another builder whose legacy carries ethical questions? Your suggestions shape future documentaries. Until next time, remember, every castle has a story, but not every story has a castle.